Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation we're having today. I used to work on some kind of similar software, or at least I was reading through the docs for the Tanzu Mission Control, and I came upon the part that had a discussion of RBAC, and I was like, yes, I remember back in when I was a programmer, having to implement RBAC for the management software I was working on, and it's always thrilling to meet my friend RBAC and get a distinction of the groups that people belong in, the users, all of the thinking that goes into setting up the right permissioning for stuff. And that's perhaps, well, I'm sure there's several thousand people who are developers and work in this space, but it's always nice to get excited about permissioning systems.
And you were setting those up as a developer?
Yeah, well, I used to work on way back when, like some systems management stuff, and in one of the early versions of our software. Of course, we had to implement not just hard coded security groups, but actual RBAC stuff to integrate with Active Directory or whatever wacky system you might have.
Right.
Which it's inexplicable that it's some sort of memory lane to go down. But anyways. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, thanks for that trip down memory lane. My name is Corey Dinkens. I'm a technical marketing architect for VMware Tanzu. And I guess to translate that into real world terms, that just means, I show you how to do cool things with the products. So instead of showing you how to build the skis, I'm showing you how I can do cool jumps with it and, flips and all that good stuff, right? So all the fun things.
That's right, and I suppose if we were to continue the metaphor out, you can you kind of hang out at the bottom of the hill in the club, the lounge,
right.
The lodge
with the cool guys, right?
Sure, and whoever is recovering from the ski patrol, helping them out, to figure out what's going on there. I don't know how far we can carry this. I'm not actually a big skier.
That's
snow
about it, though.
Or water.
You hit the end of it there, so.
Well. There's a new version of Tanzu Mission Control out. So I thought, it'd be a good time to kind of just check in and see what's going on there. And first of all, what is Tanzu Mission Control? Give us an overview of the features that it has, what it does, what it's trying to solve, basically.
Sure. And I'll try and give you the summarized version, because I could really be here probably for the rest of the podcast if I wanted, just listing out everything it does. So
sure,
I think we'll hit some of the more high level points that I care about. Just a quick sidebar as to my background. Prior to this marketing role, I was a systems admin / platform engineer / everything else under the sun when it came to networks and managing the help desk for the companies that I worked at. So my framing for a lot of this is kind of like, how would I have used this tool in my past jobs to really get my job done? So that's kind of how I approach this kind of, tool when I explain it. So I think to get into what Mission Control actually does, the whole point of it is to help users manage their Kubernetes clusters. Because right now it's a pretty big challenge for a lot of people. Most of it is still done with command line. Most of it is still done with a lot of YAML files. And for people that are coming from the vSphere type background, and maybe they're Windows admins and aren't quite used to as much command line. And I know there's a lot of people using PowerShell out there, so I don't want to forget that community.
Sure.
But there's still a lot of people that aren't into command line, right? So beyond that, there's still a lot of people that aren't quite sure they're kind of intimidated by Kubernetes, right? Because they keep hearing it's this new big thing, that it's everywhere, and it does all this stuff for them. They just don't quite get, what it's doing or how it's getting there. And so we won't dive into all that, but, I guess the way I look at it is they're just really small VMs, right? And there's just a bunch of them. So,
right.
The point of Tanzu Mission Control, again, is to really help you manage these clusters in such a way that you don't really need to go into command line, and helps you structure things in such a way that you can kind of use the set it and forget it type model. I like to think of Active Directory as a good mental model for how Mission Control structures all of its internal resources. So the way that you primarily group objects is that you have cluster groups. And I think the name is pretty obvious, right? Like you can group up clusters and you can do things with those. And for a lot of companies, what the cluster group view is more like the platform ops / platform engineering type role. So, really focused on the users that are going to manage the infrastructure, define policies for those. So things like security policies, can we have pods running as root? Where do we want our images to come from? Should it only be a trusted registry? Do we want Bitcoin miners coming from the Docker registry? Probably not, so doing little things like that. Even as simple as, this is a commonly overlooked problem, but just disallowing the latest tag. Like a lot of people don't realize how many issues that's caused in production environments where, admin doesn't check. They just leave the latest tag on a deployment and a big update breaks everything, right? So I've seen it. I don't know if you have, but it's not uncommon. So
right, because you have this you have this unplanned, potentially unexpected, just like new thing enters to grossly simplify it, and you would like the chance to verify that it works with what you have instead of it just automatically deploying.
Yeah, that's the ideal. Exactly, that's the ideal scenario, right? Test it before you deploy it. Make sure things don't break. I mean, pretty standard stuff. So, so you can apply all those to your cluster groups. You can even have specific policies that are called mutation policies, where they kind of are one step above the standard security policy that just denies workloads and says, nah, you don't have the right properties. This is denied. This will actually take the workload in and it will configure the settings that you've defined and inject those into the workload YAML. So a good example of that is developers a lot of times don't necessarily care about like run as users, security context, constructs, things like that. They just want to build their app, send it on, and get results, right? And test the app essentially. So the security teams or operations teams can define, a default run as user, default, do I want to allow pods to run as root? You can configure all these settings. And when they submit the workload YAML, if those are not present, they will automatically be added to that and present when the workload arrives. So, kind of removing the burden at lower levels to have to fill out these YAML manifests with like, we got Joe Kubernetes who accidentally added a tab instead of, 4 spaces again and broke everything, like we don't have to worry about little issues like that. And they can, developers can focus on just doing development stuff, right? Like kind of getting out of the security game if they don't need to be. So, so those are some of the things that you can do. And there's a few other different policy types that you can apply. But what I wanted to go over next is the other construct that you can also use to kind of group your different clusters together. And the construct's called workspaces, and it gives you the ability to group different namespaces together across different clusters. So, for example, if you have an application, we'll just say application A, and that's your line of business app. You can have an application A namespace across a cluster in your vSphere environment on-prem. You can have it running in, Amazon, EKS. You can have it in Azure, etc. And this workspace will group together all those clusters, and you can apply an access policy to that workspace. So a developer can say, or not a developer, but a developer would then get access to all of the namespaces within that work group across different clusters, right? And that essentially allows you a way to authenticate one time against an endpoint, and you're able to then interact with all the different clusters in your environment that you have access to. So you no longer have to pull down a bunch of kube configs and, switch context a whole bunch. So it's a pretty And I guess to clarify, right, this is more of an application operator / like developer type view where
Yeah.
you would generally grant them access to these namespaces so they can deploy things, right, or do things, troubleshoot, check logs, etc. So just those two groupings alone offer you quite a bit of flexibility as far as like how you can structure your environment, or even how you can mirror, Tanzu Mission Control to meet your existing environmental settings, right? And kind of how your existing model, your, I guess, resource model works.
Yeah. So let me try to rephrase back to you a lot of what you've been saying there, because I think there's something interesting I hadn't really thought of before, and that is, well, so first of all, you're running your Kubernetes stuff here, and you've got some developers who are going to be running their applications in it, and like at a minimum, what's required there, and not required for like hygienic good practices, but just to achieve that goal is, the developers need to have basically have made a bunch of container images of what their application is. And then they're going to have a lot of configuration, a lot of YAML that basically says, yeah, exactly. That basically says, here's how you take these containers, and the developer is talking to Jane Kubernetes. I guess this is Joe Kubernetes talking to Jane
or Joe, whoever.
Yeah, sure. Jay Kubernetes. And basically the developer says, all right, in all of this YAML, this is describing how I want you to take these containers and deploy them into the cluster. The terminology gets a little loosey here, but deploy them into the overall runtime environment. Yep. And here's how they'll communicate with each other. Here's the permissions that they have. Here's how they connect to databases, so forth and so on. Right? Yep.
Exactly.
So everyone who has investigated Kubernetes for 3 to 5 minutes knows that there's a lot of YAML, and no one likes that.
Yep.
Right?
It's a lot.
Right. And it is almost an interesting peculiarity, I think, of Kubernetes, that this YAML is both the configuration and to some extent like the API for how to interact with it, which I always find bizarre that you wrap those things together, but whatever. No one asked me to be involved, and I did not volunteer either. So that's, I think, where a lot of the complexity comes from. So in even, you don't have to be that large of an organization, right? But in kind of any size organization where you're trying to not have one team do everything, and especially in much larger organizations, you want to make sure that people are not only following best practices, but also not creating problems through just not knowing what they're doing.
Single point of failures, Michael.
That's exactly
not a good thing.
And so even though this, you've got this peculiar, at least to me, YAML thing, what it affords you is this opportunity that when a developer goes to J Kubernetes and says here's my application made up of images and stuff, and here's the configuration in the YAML, you can kind of give that over into Tanzu Mission Control land, whatever the kind of port is there. And what's going to happen is that the people who are running Kubernetes and trying to defeat the single point of failure, so to speak, essentially they're given the chance, and not manually, but this is all what ends up happening is they've established some policy, as you were saying, about what kind of security rights are done, how things are configured, so forth and so on. And because of that nature of YAML, basically you can just go in and not only add to what's in the YAML, but you can kind of modify it and mess around with it and make sure that how you want things to be configured, the way you want applications to run in Kubernetes are enforced.
Exactly.
Right? And that's kind of the nice part. That is one of the nice parts about the API as plain text file nature of Kubernetes, is you're given all these points as people who are running Kubernetes to make sure it's running well and in the policy that you've set up.
Yep. And kind of where that comes into play, right, is when you're looking at doing kind of securing an environment, right? Lowering blast radius for breaches. And if you're designing an application, it's generally best practice to have, you have different run as users for your web app as you do for your database app, right? So being able to architect an application in such a way where you're saying, all of our web applications, we ensure always get this specific run as user. They always get this, FS group.
Right.
You're really able to start to do things like, wait a second, why is a web username trying to access like database data? Like we have a serious problem here, right? Like little things like that you can use as very big indicators of, greater issues throughout the org. So,
right.
It's kind of an important point to be able to, I guess, understand what you are expecting and what something should be, right? So that you can track what happens with it as a result.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point too, that you're given the chance to like inspect what the configuration is, essentially. And particularly as you're going over, like, in the second part of your saying, right? Like this ability to modify, change, or you just set the configuration means that you have, as long as the developers haven't done some wacky thing like hard code things or hide what they're doing from you, like you essentially have the ability to have full control over all of your permissioning and the security things you would care about, because you can go in there and set things and make them work well. Which all right, so that makes sense if I'm not talking crazy.
No, and I think the other point here is, right, is you can do all this through the GUI, right? This doesn't have to be with YAML, doesn't have to be with CLI. You can. Those are all options, but, again, this is kind of like AD for clusters where you can go in, define your policies, set it one time. And kind of to your point about, like, I guess you being able to utilize the different Kubernetes constructs and existing stuff there to work for you. You don't even have to scope your policies to individual cluster groups or workspaces. You can just use like labels if you would like to. So you can exclude stuff based on label. You can include it based on label. So if you really wanted to, you could set things just at one organization level and just have them apply based on label types, right?
Right. And you're highlighting a very important thing again at like, when you start managing a lot of Kubernetes or a lot of anything,
even
which is
three, like even more than three. I talked to someone at Explore last year, and they kind of were like, "What is this product? What does it do?" And I explained it to them, and they're like, "Wow, it takes me anywhere between 5 to 8 hours to set up a new cluster, and we only have 5 of them."
Right.
So, multiply that as they grow. You can imagine this person's like, oh my goodness, like I've got a road in front of me, right, that I have to walk down, and it's going to be tedious, right?
Right. And as we were saying, that's where the concept of being able to group together clusters and also like treat. I mean having the nesting eggs go up so that you can deal with things as an administrator and aggregate in groups and name them. And then also like the flexibility of adding tags or labels. So like, I mean, anyone who's worked with something where you can tag things, it's just another angle to slice things up, basically. And
it's a necessity.
In this case, apply policy to it. Okay. So we've got that policy enforcement going on. Like what else? And again, the fact that it's in a UI. Like what are some other components of Tanzu Mission Control?
I think for me the two biggest, I'd say, quote unquote, well, 3. So we hit one, which is RBAC and policy. That for me is huge. I think the second one is being able to utilize Flux continuous delivery under the hood. So we have integrations with Flux where you can configure this for individual clusters if you would like, or cluster groups. And what that will allow you to do is, and I guess we'll pause briefly for those that don't know what Flux is. So it's a continuous delivery tool that you connect to a Git repo. It inspects the repo and pulls down all of the YAML objects that you have there. And it will do it. I want to say do things with those YAML on the cluster. Kind
That's a good technical phrase.
Yeah, because it can be install a package, it can be create a config map, right? It can be a number of different things. And as long as it's a native Kubernetes object, it can be ingested. And
yes,
the other part that powers this engine is the customize engine. That's with a K. So essentially, Flux will synchronize these YAML files, and then it will reconcile them against what is running in the cluster. So if you make a change to one of those YAML files, that change will get reflected in the cluster after a certain, synchronization period of time. So what you can really do with this, and if you, kind of expand this to your operations and how you can actually use this in the real world, a pretty common example that I would look at using this for is, I want my logging agent on every cluster that I deploy. So whether it's prod, dev, test, whatever, I need this logging agent on it. Now, the level of logging on that might be different per level. So I might only set it debug in the dev environment and, something else in the other environments. But, you can essentially define, applications, settings, or sets of configurations that get applied to groups of clusters. So any cluster you move into that group or any new cluster that's created in that group will then assume or receive all of these new settings or packages that you've defined for it. So you can define ingress controllers. There's a number of different things you could do. And, another common example I would use is probably, if you want to have ingress controllers that reside in multiple different regions, right? So we'll just say you have one in the US, you have one in Europe, etc. You can configure that group in such a way that any new cluster added to it automatically gets ingress. And so you can turn up new regions much quicker than you would have been able to if you have to manually apply all these settings and test them and configure them, etc. So, there's quite a bit of power in being able to just define these different groups and apply these different sets of configs or applications to them based on those groupings.
Yeah, and it kind of as to add to what you're saying there, right? I get the word policy often seems like
overloaded
rules, right? Like here's rules and constraints, but it can also mean defaults, so to speak. Just like as you're saying, whenever a new cluster comes up, here's how we want ingress set up, and that's the policy that we have, which is just the default, how we want things to run. And I think also what you're getting there with Flux is so if you like this continuous delivery idea and this idea of GitOps, where you kind of just basically say this is what and of course you put it in Git or whatever or your image repository, but it's at the end of a pipeline, and now here's the state that I want production to be in, and essentially that's what you can hook that up to everything and have it just sort of magically be deployed into Kubernetes. I guess it's not really magic.
It's not, but
yeah. But I that's the other thing that I think is interesting about Kubernetes is built into it is this idea of you don't have to turn it off and turn it back on to deploy something new. It's more of just I'm sure you can tune this however soft or hard you want it to be, but it's as things get updated, add a new agent to it, right? Or you can force the config to go out, but in theory, it should enable you to do kind of rolling upgrades
100%.
More or less effectively, right? Which is great. It just means that you have better availability and uptime if you, again, as always, if your applications are written appropriately to know oh, here's the new version and here's the old version, I can cope, right? As the upgrade pans out there. But it's good to pull all that together into one sort of thing instead of having to cobble it together yourself. So what else? Since that was, we're doing the Corey's personal favorites of Tanzu Mission Control.
That's one of them for sure. And to your point, right? Normally to achieve what we're talking about, you have to go to the CNCF website, right? Look at their landscape. I don't know if you've looked at it, but it's pretty big. There's a lot of stuff on it. So you have to go and pick and choose which of those components you want. You have to manually configure them and deploy them. So, what we're offering is a pretty significant time saver over what you would be looking at of just manually piecing all these components together.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the word I've started to like use in my head is things are integrated, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like you could you have to integrate all this stuff already because there's so many, there's almost too many choices. You could also look at it as like, oh, there's so many options.
paralysis analysis.
Whatever type of functionality I want, it's available. It's the classic. I forget who wrote this up, but in the 90s there was the analysis of like American consumer culture that like there's too much cereal and you just get overwhelmed by the choice. But I think there's a tremendous amount of value, especially people who are just operating platforms of infrastructure of just like, it'd be cool if this stuff was just integrated together instead of having to do it. And I think even like having someone else make that decision, I always envision it saves you a lot of annoying meetings where you debate what you should do.
It does. It really does, because we've seen year over year the State of Kubernetes report that we publish. Like DIY tooling is on the way out. People are over it. They're over having the single point of failure of Kubernetes is, they manage the tooling and they're the only one that seems to know how all this stuff works, right? And like companies can't have that, right? Like that's just not a way of operating efficiently. So yeah, I think it's an important thing to really get under control. And I'd say a point that a lot of people kind of miss too is when it comes to like training up teams and like, junior members of teams and help desk teams to like support and like be able to help like spread the load right across teams. This GUI methodology is a way that users can actually do quite a bit of Kubernetes stuff without ever touching a CLI, right? Like if they really wanted to, you can have a run book that walks them through adding a Flux repository that adds your debug tracing tooling, right? They don't have to know Kubernetes really. They just have to know how to input a couple directories and, a couple of values for a Git repo, but they can then become part of your troubleshooting process and team process of, hey, before we escalate this all the way up to, engineering or, these higher levels, we can do these things prior to doing all of that, right? And get to a resolution hopefully quicker. So tell me, I want to get to the newest version, like of Tanzu Mission Control. What's fun about that? But tell me the other things that just we haven't gone over yet. Just kind of give us a little preview for everyone who wants to dig into it more. What are the other major areas? I'd say other major areas to look at are, so we have support for the Bitnami Helm app catalog. So the public catalog that you see at bitnami.com is fully available through and within the Tanzu Mission Control GUI. So you can deploy Helm charts to any cluster that's in your environment, right? That's pretty simple and pretty powerful, I think, because you can do it through the GUI. You do have to configure some YAML depending on the app or the package, but I think that's another huge step forward. And you can also deploy those Helm charts to a cluster group if you would like. So the next iteration is here. So we'll hopefully be allowing you to do that with the Bitnami public app repo, but that's coming soon. So I'd say that's another good area to look out for. And then the data protection, we've got a lot of great features coming out for that and a lot of new functionality. So that's a space that I would keep my eye on because we're going to be having some pretty cool announcements soon.
And then, so what are the types of Kubernetes that are supported?
So as far as lifecycle management goes, the Tanzu Kubernetes distribution is fully supported and Amazon EKS. Any other CF conformant distro supports all of the other functionality, or rather, Mission Control supports all the other functionality within it.
Right.
Except for lifecycle management. Right.
Okay.
So if it's a CNCF conformant cluster, you can do all the things except lifecycle manage. If it's Tanzu Kubernetes or Amazon EKS, you can lifecycle manage and do all the other stuff.
Mm. Is that because like lifecycle management is not part of Kubernetes, and so it's like unique to each of the different like services or distros, so extra work is needed for that?
It is, yeah. And VMware's tried to help smooth some of that out by contributing the cluster API and cluster class, like I guess we'll just say code to the Kubernetes official code base. And so that was one way that we're trying to essentially address that disparity between cluster types. So
Yeah.
hopefully that will help smooth some of that out. But
Well, we'll find out in the future, where we all shall live.
yeah.
So, okay, all right. So tell us about the new version.
Yeah, so I guess one of the most important things that I want to talk about is the new version that's coming out. The existing version is completely SaaS based, and it's hosted in Amazon AWS. And for some of our customers and companies that either are a competitor to Amazon or they have, data sovereignty laws that are local to that country, there's a whole number of reasons why many companies just said, sorry, we would really like the package version. Rather, we need the package version. So once that's available, let us know and, we'll take a look at the product, right? So we've had a lot of companies that just we couldn't really service as customers because of how the product is built and operated essentially. So
As a SaaS.
as a SaaS software. Yeah.
Yep.
And so that has just changed, and we're looking at offering a package version. Well, not looking at, but we'll be offering the package version of the software, and you'll be able to install it in the environment of your choice. So whether that's air-gapped, whether that's in your private data center, basically outside of Amazon if you'd like to, inside of Amazon, it's really going to be up to you. But the point is download it, deploy it where you want it, manage Kubernetes with it, right?
Yeah. And like you're saying, it is, well, especially if you've, I don't know, to put it in a super corny way, if you've got your head up in the clouds, like it's often astonishing how many people are just like, there's just a brick wall of running something in the cloud. And, often for good reasons, sometimes for evolving reasons, but it's essentially like there's, why limit the functionality? But yeah, I mean, I've already talked with several people who are very thrilled about the option to be able to do things on premises or under their own control. And I think the whole the point of it being an easier way to manage things rather than having to handcraft stuff, right? Like that just that means having it available to as wide amount of people as possible is great, because everyone wants things to be easier.
They do. And that was one of the challenges is, again, some companies just, their laws just say they can't run stuff where our stuff is hosted. I mean, I don't know what the laws look like in where you're at, Michael, but I'm sure they've got their own data sovereignty laws, for their citizens. And companies that operate across these, national borders or international borders, it's very difficult for them to try and solve this like data locality issue. And in many cases, it was very expensive. So I think, one of the other components of this self-managed release is that this is going to become part of the sovereign cloud providers offering that we have here at VMware. So a good example is companies that, operate out of EMEA, right? Most of them, if they're operating in multiple countries, they need to have data services and data retention local to those countries. And in many cases, what they're looking to are these sovereign cloud providers of those different, countries. So soon these cloud providers will be able to say, hey, we now have a version of Tanzu Mission Control that we can offer you. We guarantee it's local, data localities here, data sovereignty is met, and, you're able to meet these regulations that you're required to abide by. I think as we saw with Facebook, they got dinged, $1 billion or something for not following those exact laws. So it's really not something that companies can't ignore, right? They just can't afford to. can't afford to just ignore it and do nothing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, the way I always think about it, right, is like, I don't know. I think in the tech world and the cloud world, right, like we have a very, let's say, American centric view. And so like, it's easy just to be like, it's the public cloud, whatever. But, it's always a good thought exercise if sovereign cloud concepts seem weird, like one, to like rethink it in your mind of like, you would like to control the jurisdiction that you operate in, right? And because that's how jurisdictions in the law works. like you have this agreed upon set of laws and regulations that you're cool operating under versus not. And then the other thing is like, well, there's probably plenty of like American companies that really like it that their stuff runs in America. They just don't have to think about it,
right?
Because it's already there. So it's like, the whole notion of like sovereign cloud stuff is perfectly understandable because like you want stuff under your jurisdiction, the one that you've agreed to operate in. And of course, as you point out, like there's also legal requirements, but that's just the same side of the same thing. So it's nice to have that flexibility. Well, great. Well, is there anything else you think we've skipped over that would be good to put out there?
Make sure to register for VMworld. Goodness gracious. VMware Explorer. It's coming up in August. I'll be out there in the booth. So if anyone wants to stop by and talk about infrastructure and clusters and Tanzu Mission Control, come and find me.
Yeah. And get some demos. Are you going to be at the Barcelona one?
I'm not sure if I'll be there yet, but definitely we'll be in Vegas. So we'll be doing demos and all the things.
Demos in the desert. That's what we need to think of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so how could people just like look up and kind of like see how Tanzu Mission Control works?
So you can go to the VMware website, tanzu.vmware.com/mission-control. And there's information on there for how you can access the hands-on labs that we have. There's other content like blogs that you can see. And then if you're looking for just technical information on how to use Tanzu Mission Control, I've written a number of different blogs and articles on our Tanzu Tech Zone website. So things like how to build API commands for it, how to do automation with Flux. You can find all of that there. So check it out.
Perfect. Well, great. Well, that was fun. Thanks for going over that and putting up with some slight education of me.
Oh, happy to.
Yeah, that was good stuff. Well, as always, you've either watched the video of this or listened to it in podcast form. And if you want to subscribe to the podcast or I'll put links to many of the things we mentioned. You can go to tanzutalk.com and look that up. Put it in your podcast subscriber. I don't even know what they're called nowadays. And listen to it in your ears while you're doing whatever you're interested in. And with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.